Chapter 1. The Beacon's Unwavering Glow. The train rattled along the Cornish coast, its rhythm a counterpoint to the restless churn of the sea beyond the window. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in a sensible tweed coat, adjusted her spectacles and peered at the jagged cliffs that loomed against the grey October sky of 1938. St. Agnes Cove. Her destination was not a place she had chosen for leisure. The letter in her reticule, penned in the spidery hand of her old friend Lady Tressilian, had been insistent. "Come, Jane. There's been a death, and the village is uneasy. You'll see what I cannot." The train slowed, hissing steam, and Miss Marple stepped onto the platform of St. Agnes Cove station. The air was sharp with salt and the tang of impending rain. She clutched her umbrella, though it was less for weather than for the comfort of something familiar in this remote place. The station was deserted save for a porter, who tipped his cap and pointed her toward the village proper. A cluster of whitewashed cottages huddled against the wind. "Mind the cliffs, miss," he called as she walked away. "They're treacherous this time of year." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp eyes noting the man's weathered face and the way his gaze darted toward the sea. She followed the winding path into the village, where the lighthouse stood sentinel on a promontory, its beam cutting through the dusk with mechanical precision. It was a comforting sight, that steady pulse of light, promising safety to ships navigating the perilous rocks below. Yet, as Lady Tressilian's letter had hinted, something was amiss. Samuel Tregennis, the lighthouse keeper, had been found dead at the base of the cliffs 2 days prior, his body broken on the rocks. The beam, they said, had never faltered. Not once. At the Seagull Inn, a squat building with salt-stained windows, Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Trelawney, the innkeeper, a stout woman with a face like a weathered figurehead. "You'll be Miss Marple, then," she said, her Cornish accent thick as clotted cream. "Lady Tressilian said to expect you. Room's ready, and there's tea by the fire." "Thank you, Miss Trelawney," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but with an edge that suggested she missed nothing. "I understand the village has had a shock." Mrs. Trelawney's hands paused on the teapot. Samuel Tregennis, terrible thing. Fell from the cliff path, they said. Coroner's calling it an accident, but... She trailed off, her eyes flickering to the window, where the lighthouse beam swept past. "But," Miss Marple prompted, settling into a chair by the fire, her knitting needles already clicking in her lap. Mrs. Trelawney lowered her voice. "Folk here don't think it was an accident. Samuel was steady as that beam, knew the cliffs like his own hand, and that lighthouse, it's never gone dark, not in 50 years, not even the night he died." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious." The inn's common room was sparsely populated. A fisherman, Jago Pulwiller, sat in a corner, his oilskin coat dripping from the drizzle outside. His eyes, dark as the sea, followed Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and wariness. At another table, Reverend Penrose, the village vicar, sipped tea and leafed through a hymn book, though his fingers trembled slightly. And by the window, Morena Tregennis, Samuel's daughter, stared at the lighthouse, her face pale and unreadable. Miss Marple noted them all, her mind already sorting impressions as neatly as her stitches. Lady Tressilian arrived shortly after, her fur-trimmed coat a touch too grand for the humble inn. "Jane, you've come," she exclaimed, clasping Miss Marple's hands. "I knew you would. This business with Samuel, it stirred up the village like a storm. The police are no help, and I fear there's more to it." "Tell me about Mr. Tregennis," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup of tea. "What sort of man was he?" Lady Tressilian hesitated, glancing at the others in the room. "He was dependable, kept that lighthouse like a sacred duty. But he was a private man," some said cold. His daughter Morena hadn't spoken to him in years until recently, and there were rumors, old ones, about his time at sea before he took the keeper's post. "Rumors?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp. "Of smuggling, perhaps, or worse. Nothing proven, mind you. But Samuel had enemies. Jago Pulwiller, for one, never liked him. And Mrs. Trelawney, she lent him money once, and there was bad blood after. Even Reverend Penrose seemed troubled by him. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the names like cards in a game of patience. And the night he died, was anyone with him? No one knows, Lady Tressilian said. He was alone in the lighthouse, as far as anyone can tell. The beam was steady all night. Jago saw it from his boat, and the Coast Guard confirmed it. Yet by morning he was dead below the cliffs. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. A lighthouse that never falters, she mused, and a keeper who falls. It's a puzzle, isn't it? That evening, as the wind howled and the lighthouse beam swept across the village, Miss Marple retired to her room. She sat by the window, watching the light's relentless arc. It was a beacon of safety, yes, but it also illuminated truths some might prefer to keep hidden. In her experience, people were much like lighthouses, steady on the surface, but with shadows lurking in their foundations. She opened her notebook and wrote, Samuel Tregennis, cliff path, beam steady, motives. Then, with a small smile, she added, villages are never as simple as they seem. Before we move on, detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comment, and if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Salt Air. The morning broke over St. Agnes Cove, with a sky like tarnished silver, the sea restless beneath it. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a breakfast of kippers and toast at the Seagull Inn, set out to explore the village. Her umbrella tapped the cobblestones, a metronome to her thoughts. The lighthouse beam had pulsed through her dreams, steady and unyielding, yet it seemed to conceal as much as it revealed. Samuel Tregennis's death was no mere accident. She was certain of that now. Villages like this one held their secrets close, but secrets in Miss Marple's experience had a way of surfacing like driftwood after a storm. She began at the village square, where the church's weathered spire pointed heavenward. Reverend Penrose was tending the rose bushes by the church gate, his cassock flecked with dew. He straightened as Miss Marple approached, his face a mix of courtesy and caution. "Good morning, Reverend," she said, her voice as gentle as the breeze. "A fine day for gardening." "Miss Marple," he replied, brushing soil from his hands. "A pleasure to see you, though I fear St. Agnes Cove offers little cheer these days, with poor Samuel gone." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "You knew Mr. Tregennis well, I take it?" The vicar hesitated, his fingers tightening around the pruning shears, as well as one can know a parishioner. Samuel was dutiful. He attended services, though he kept his thoughts to himself. A solitary man, but not unkind. "Solitary," Miss Marple echoed, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "Yet he must have had friends, or perhaps enemies." Reverend Penrose's lips thinned. "Enemies is a strong word, Miss Marple. There were disagreements, as there are in any village. Samuel could be stubborn. He and Jago Polwiller had words now and then. Something about fishing rights near the lighthouse rocks, and Mrs. Trelawney. Well, she had her own troubles with him." "Troubles?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her gaze was sharp. The vicar glanced toward the inn, then lowered his voice. "Money matters, I believe, but you'd best ask her. I try not to heed gossip." He paused, then added, "Samuel's death has unsettled us all. The coroner says he fell, but the cliffs are narrow there. It's hard to believe he'd be so careless." Miss Marple nodded, filing away his words. "Thank you, Reverend. I'll let you get back to your roses. They're lovely, though, that one." She pointed to a wilting bloom seems to need a bit of care. As she walked away, she felt the vicar's eyes on her back. His unease was palpable, like the damp in the air. She made a mental note. Reverend Penrose knows more than he says. Alibi. Her next stop was the harbour, where fishing boats bobbed against the quay. Jago Polwiller was mending nets, his hands deft despite their calluses. He was a man of middle years, with a face carved by wind and salt, and eyes that seemed to hold the sea itself. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his expression guarded. "Morning, Miss Polwheeler," she said, pausing by his boat. The gull's cry. "I'm Miss Marple, staying at the inn. I hear you're the man to speak to about the sea." Jago's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Depends what you're asking, miss. Sea's a wide subject." "I was thinking of the lighthouse," she said, her voice light. "It must be a comfort to you fishermen, knowing its beam is steady, especially the night Mr. Tregennis died." Jago's hands stilled, the net slipping slightly. "It was steady. I was out late hauling crab pots, saw the beam myself, sweeping like always. Didn't know till morning that Samuel was dead." Miss Marple leaned on her umbrella, studying him. "You and Mr. Tregennis were neighbors, in a way, with the lighthouse so close to your fishing grounds. Did you get on?" Jago's eyes narrowed. "Well enough. He kept to his light, I kept to my nets. We had a row or two, him saying I fished too close to the rocks, me saying he had no claim to the sea, but I didn't wish him dead." "Of course not," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Though villages do talk, don't they? I heard there was bad blood between you." Jago snorted, resuming his work. "Village talks like seaweed clings to everything. Ask Marvena, his daughter. She'd know more about Samuel's troubles than me." Miss Marple thanked him and turned away, noting the tension in his shoulder. Jago Polwheeler, defensive, hide something. Was he really at sea that night? Her final encounter came by chance, near the post office. Marvena Tregennis, a slight woman in her 30s with hair the color of wet sand, was posting a letter. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from grief or sleeplessness, Miss Marple couldn't tell. "Miss Tregennis," she said gently. "I'm Jane Marple, a friend of Lady Tressilian's. I'm so sorry about your father." Marvena's gaze flickered, wary but not hostile. "Thank you. It's a shock. I hadn't seen him much these past years. But to think he fell like that. It must be difficult," Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confidence. "Had you been in touch recently?" Marvena clutched her shawl tighter. "A little. I came back to the village a month ago to settle things. Father wasn't pleased to see me. We had words." She bit her lip, then added, "I don't believe he fell by chance, Miss Marple. He wasn't a careless man." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was racing. "What makes you say that, my dear?" Marvena shook her head. "I can't say, not yet, but he had secrets, and someone knew them." She turned abruptly and walked away, her footsteps quick on the cobblestone. Back at the inn, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as she reviewed the morning's gleanings. The village was a tapestry of whispers, grudges, debts and secrets, all woven around the lighthouse and its keep. Reverend Penrose's reticence, Jago's defensiveness, Marvena's fear, they were threads she would need to unravel, and the lighthouse itself, with its unfaltering beam, stood at the heart of it all. Mrs. Trelawney bustled in with fresh tea. "Find what you were looking for, Miss Marple." "Oh, I'm only beginning," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "But villages, you know, are much like my knitting. Tug one thread, and the pattern begins to show." As the lighthouse beams swept past the window, Miss Marple added a note to her notebook. "Suspects. Motives. The beam hides more than it shows." Chapter 3. The Keeper's Last Night. The wind had sharpened by noon, rattling the windows of the Seagull Inn, as Miss Jane Marple sat in the common room, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced like the village's secrets. She had spent the morning piecing together impressions of St. Agnes's Cove and its inhabitants, but impressions were not enough. To understand Samuel Tregennis's death, she needed facts, cold, hard details of his final hours. The lighthouse beam, steady as it was, seemed to mock the chaos of that night. Lady Tressilian had arranged for Miss Marple to meet Dr. Pengelly, the village coroner, who doubled as the local physician. He arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, a wiry man with a face like crumpled parchment and eyes that missed little. He carried a leather satchel from which he produced a thin file labelled Tregennis. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her. "Lady Tressilian says you've a knack for getting to the bottom of things. I'll tell you what I know, but it's straightforward enough. Samuel Tregennis died of a fall. No mystery in that." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her gaze was keen. "Straightforward perhaps, Dr. Pengelly, but I find even the simplest things can have unexpected angles. Please tell me about that night." Dr. Pengelly opened the file, his fingers precise. "It was Wednesday last October. Samuel was found at dawn by Jago Polwally, who was heading out to his boat. Body was at the base of the cliffs, just below the lighthouse path. Skull fractured, neck broken, multiple contusions, consistent with a fall from 30 feet or more. Time of death, I'd estimate between 10 p.m. and midnight." Miss Marple's needles paused. "And the lighthouse? I hear the beam was steady all night." "Away," Pengelly said, nodding. "Jago saw it from the harbor around 11. Coast Guard logs confirm it was operating normally. Samuel must have left the light to tend to something outside, perhaps a loose shutter or a signal lamp, and lost his footing on the path." "Must he?" Miss Marple murmured, her tone mild. "Was he alone that night?" Pengelly shrugged. "No witness. The lighthouse is isolated, and Samuel lived there alone. Morena, his daughter, was at her cottage in the village. No one else had reason to be up there, especially with a storm brewing." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "A storm? I hadn't heard." "Not a big one," Pengelly clarified. "Wind and drizzle, mostly. The path was slick, which supports the accident theory. No signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, just a man who took a wrong step." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And his health? Was he steady on his feet?" "Fit as a fiddle," Pengelly said. "Samuel was 62 but strong. No history of fainting or dizziness. I examined him myself a month ago for a cough. Heart and lungs sound." "Curious," Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their rhythm. "A strong man familiar with the cliffs falls on a familiar path. And the lighthouse, did you inspect it?" Pengelly's brow furrowed. "The mechanism? No need. It was working, as I said. The Coast Guard checks it weekly, and Samuel was meticulous. Oil levels, wicks, lenses, all in order." Miss Marple nodded, though her mind was turning over a detail she couldn't yet place. "One last thing, Doctor. Was there anything unusual on the body? A note perhaps, or something in his pockets?" Pengelly hesitated, then flipped a page in his file. "Just the usual. Pipe, matches, a pocket knife. Oh, and a key. Brass, likely for the lighthouse door. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Thank you, Dr. Pengelly," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "You've been most helpful." As the coroner left, Miss Marple added to her notebook. "Time of death, midnight. No struggle. Key, beam, steady. Why leave the lighthouse?" She tapped her pencil against the page, her thoughts circling the word key. Her next opportunity came unexpectedly. Mrs. Trelawney, clearing plates from a nearby table, overheard the conversation and lingered. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "but I heard you asking about Samuel's last night. I saw him, you know, that evening." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Did you, Mrs. Trelawney? Do tell." The innkeeper glanced around, then sat, her hands twisting in her apron. It was about 8 o'clock. Samuel came in for his supper, as he did most nights, had his usual fish pie and a pint. He was quiet, but that wasn't new. "Only," she paused, frowning. "Only," Miss Marple prompted, her tone inviting. "He seemed on edge, kept looking at the door like he was expecting someone, and he left earlier than usual, before 9, said he had to get back to the light." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Did anyone speak to him, or follow him out?" Mrs. Trelawney shook her head. "Not that I saw. Jago was here, but he was at the bar talking with some lads. Reverend Penrose came in later, after Samuel left. And Morena, she wasn't here at all." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind sifting through the new information. Samuel, edgy, expecting someone, a key in his pocket, a beam that never faltered. She decided to seek out another perspective, and found Morena Tregennis at the churchyard, placing flowers on a fresh grave. Her father's, no doubt. Miss Tregennis, Miss Marple said, approaching softly. I hope I'm not intruding. I've just spoken with Dr. Pengelly about your father's last night. I wonder if you might share what you know. Morena's face was pale, her eyes shadowed. I wasn't with him, she said quickly. I was at my cottage reading. I didn't know he was gone until morning. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze kind but searching. Of course. But had he seemed troubled to you recently? Mrs. Trelawney said he was uneasy that evening. Morena's fingers tightened on the flowers. Father was always uneasy. He didn't trust people. He wrote to me, a week before, asking me to come back to the village. Said he needed to tell me something. But when I saw him, he wouldn't say what it was. He just told me to stay away from the lighthouse. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Stay away? How strange. Did he say why? No, Morena whispered. But he was afraid. I could see it in his eyes. As Miss Marple walked back to the inn, the lighthouse beam began its evening sweep, cutting through the gathering dusk. She paused, watching its relentless arc. Samuel had left the inn early, returned to his post, and died hours later. Yet the light had shone on. Something in that sequence nagged at her, like a dropped stitch in her knitting. She opened her notebook and wrote, Samuel expected someone, afraid. Key. The lighthouse holds the answer. Chapter 4. Shadows on the cliff path. The cliffs of St. Agnes's Cove rose stark against the morning sky, their jagged edges softened by a thin mist that clung to the coast. Miss Jane Marple, clad in her sturdy tweed coat and sensible shoes, navigated the narrow path leading to the lighthouse. Her umbrella served as a walking stick, tapping the uneven ground as she climbed. The sea roared below, its waves crashing against the rocks where Samuel Tregennis had met his end. The lighthouse beam, now dormant in the daylight, seemed to watch her approach, its silence as enigmatic as its nighttime pulse. Miss Marple had decided to see the scene of the tragedy for herself. Village gossip and coroner's reports were all very well, but nothing matched the clarity of standing where the event had occurred. The path was steep, bordered by gorse and slippery shale, and she moved with care, mindful of the porter's warning about the cliff's treachery. As she neared the lighthouse, its whitewashed tower loomed above, a solitary guardian against the vastness of the sea. The cliff path widened slightly near the lighthouse door, but to the left it narrowed perilously, dropping sharply to the rocks below. Miss Marple paused, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. The path showed signs of recent disturbance, scuffed earth, a few broken twigs of gorse, but nothing conclusive. She crouched, her knees protesting, and examined a patch of mud. There, faintly pressed, was the outline of a boot, its tread distinct but blurred by rain. She made a mental note. Boot print, too large for Samuel. The lighthouse door was unlocked, a heavy brass key still in the lock. Miss Marple recalled Dr. Pengelly's mention of a key found in Samuel's pocket. 2 keys then, she thought, her mind turning over the discrepancy. She stepped inside, the air cool and tinged with the scent of oil and metal. The spiral staircase wound upward to the lantern room, and she climbed slowly, her hand on the iron rail. At the top the lantern gleamed, its lenses polished to a mirror's clarity. The mechanism, a clockwork system of gears and weights, was still, but a logbook on a small table caught her eye. She opened it, noting Samuel's neat handwriting. October 4th, 10 p.m. Oil refilled, wick trim, all in order. The entry for October 5th, the night of his death, was identical, logged at 8 p.m. Before he went to the inn, she mused, but nothing after. As she descended, she noticed a small hatch in the wall near the base of the stairs, half hidden behind a coil of rope. It was locked, but the key in the door fit perfectly. Inside was a cramped storage space, containing spare wicks, a can of oil, and tucked in a corner a small tin box. Miss Marple opened it carefully, revealing a bundle of paper. Most were receipts, but one was a letter, its ink faded but legible. It read, Samuel, you can't keep it hidden forever. Meet me, or I tell all. It was unsigned, but the paper bore a faint watermark. A crest Miss Marple recognized as belonging to a local family, the Trelawneys. Her heart quickened. Blackmail. She tucked the letter into a reticule, resolving to examine it later. As she stepped outside, the wind tugged at her hat, and she caught sight of a figure on the cliff path below. Jago Polwhaler, his oilskin coat unmistakable. He was staring at the rocks where Samuel had fallen, his posture tense. Miss Marple called out, but the wind swallowed her voice, and Jago turned abruptly, disappearing toward the harbor. She made her way down the path, pausing at the spot where Samuel's body had been found. The rocks below were jagged, stained with seaweed and salt. No railing guarded the path's edge, and a misstep in the dark, especially in drizzle, could easily be fatal. Yet something troubled her. Samuel, by all accounts, was cautious, familiar with every inch of this path. Why had he been here at all, so late at night? As she reached the village, she encountered Mrs. Trelawney, carrying a basket of laundry. The innkeeper's face tightened at the sight of Miss Marple's muddied shoes. "Been up to the lighthouse, have you?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Yes," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "A remarkable structure, though I wonder, Mrs. Trelawney, if you ever visited Mr. Tregennis there, perhaps to discuss business." Mrs. Trelawney's hand stilled on her basket. "I lent him money once, years ago, for lighthouse repairs. He paid it back, mostly. No need for me to go traipsing up those cliffs." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes noting the woman's flushed cheeks. "But you must hear things running the air. Did anyone mention seeing Samuel on the path that night?" Mrs. Trelawney hesitated. "Not directly, but old Tom, the baker, said he saw a light moving on the cliffs around 10. Thought it was Samuel with a lantern, checking the path. He's half blind, mind you, so who knows?" Miss Marple thanked her, and continued to the village, her mind buzzing. A lantern on the cliffs, an unsigned letter, a second key, and Jago lingering at the scene. As she passed the church, Reverend Penrose emerged, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he said, "I was hoping to find you. There's something I ought to say." She stopped, her expression encouraging. "Yes, Reverend." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "That night, I was walking near the cliffs, praying. I saw a shadow moving near the lighthouse, just after 10. I thought it was Samuel, but it moved, oddly, too quick, perhaps. I didn't think much of it then, but now." He trailed off, his eyes troubled. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to itch for action. "A shadow," she repeated. "How curious. Did you see anyone else?" "No," he said quickly. "I returned home soon after. But I thought you should know." As he hurried away, Miss Marple added to her notebook, "Boot print, second key, blackmail letter, Trelawney crest, Jago at cliffs, shadow at 10. Why was Samuel outside? The lighthouse, with its unerring beam, seemed to taunt her with its silence. But silence, she knew, could speak volumes to those who listened. That evening, as the beam began its sweep across the darkening cove, Miss Marple sat by her window, the letter from the tin box in her hand. She felt the threads of the mystery tightening, like a stitch pulled taut. Someone had lured Samuel to his death, and the lighthouse knew more than it let on. Chapter 5. The Daughter's Secret. The rain had begun in earnest by late afternoon, a steady drizzle that turned the cobblestones of St. Agnes Cove slick and gleaming. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, sat in the parlor of the Seagull Inn, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the patter against the windows. The blackmail letter, tucked safely in her reticule, weighed on her mind. Its threatening words, "Samuel, you can't keep it hidden forever. Meet me or I tell all," suggested a motive for murder, and the Trelawney crest hinted at a connection to the innkeeper. But Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Villages were like her knitting. One wrong stitch could unravel the whole pattern. She decided to speak with Morena Tregennis, Samuel's estranged daughter, whose guarded demeanor and cryptic remarks hinted at deeper truths. Miss Marple found her at the village post office, mailing another letter. Morena's shawl was damp, her face pale as the mist outside, and her eyes darted nervously as Miss Marple approached. "Good afternoon, Miss Tregennis," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but probing. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I was hoping we might have a chat perhaps about your father." Morena's fingers tightened on her letter, which she quickly slipped into the postbox. "There's not much to say, Miss Marple. He's gone, and I'm trying to make sense of it." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Losing a father is hard, especially when you'd only just begun to reconnect. You mentioned he was afraid. Might you share a bit more? It could help us understand what happened." Morena hesitated, glancing at the rain-streaked window. "Could we walk? I don't like talking here. Too many ears." They stepped outside, Miss Marple's umbrella shielding them both as they strolled toward the churchyard, where the wind was less fierce. Morena's steps were quick, as if she were fleeing something more than the rain. "Father wrote to me a month ago," she began, her voice low. "He said he needed to see me, that it was urgent. I hadn't been back to St. Agnes Cove in years, not since I left at 18. We'd fallen out." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but alert. "Families can be complicated. What had caused the rift, if I may ask?" Morena's lips pressed into a thin line. "He didn't approve of my choices. I wanted to study, to leave the village. He thought a woman's place was here, married, keeping house. We argued and I left. But when he wrote he sounded different, desperate, almost." They paused by the churchyard gate, where Samuel's grave lay under a simple stone. Miss Marple noted the fresh flowers, now wilting in the rain. "And when you saw him, did he tell you what troubled him?" Morena shook her head. "He wouldn't say much, just that he'd done something long ago, something he regretted. He kept looking out at the lighthouse, as if it held the answer. And he gave me this." She reached into her pocket and produced a small brass key, smaller than the one Miss Marple had seen at the lighthouse. "He said to keep it safe, but not to use it unless I had to." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Another key. May I see it?" she asked. Morena handed it over, and Miss Marple examined it closely. It was finely crafted, with a delicate engraving of a wave, unlike the utilitarian lighthouse key. "Did he say what it opens?" "No," Morena said, her voice trembling. "But he was scared, Miss Marple. He said if anything happened to him, I should leave the village and never come back." Miss Marple returned the key, her mind racing. "And the night he died, you were at your cottage, you said?" "Yes," Morena replied too quickly. "Reading. Alone." Her eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught the telltale sign of a half-truth. "She's hiding something," she thought, but pressed gently. "I see. And did you notice anything unusual that night? A light on the cliffs, perhaps? Or a visitor to the village?" Morena's gaze dropped to the ground. I heard the lighthouse beam, same as always. It's loud, you know. The mechanism. I didn't see anything else." She paused, then added, "But I found something, after he died, in his cottage, when I went to collect his things." She reached into her shawl and produced a folded paper, its edges worn. "It was hidden in his Bible. I didn't know what to make of it." Miss Marple unfolded the paper carefully. It was a receipt, dated 10 years prior, for a substantial sum paid to a solicitor in Plymouth. The note scrawled on it read, "For services rendered. Silence secured." The solicitor's name was unfamiliar, but the sum was staggering enough to buy a small boat or a year's rent. "This is most interesting," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but her mind alight. "May I keep this for now? I'll return it, of course." Morena nodded, her eyes wary. "Just be careful, Miss Marple. Father's secrets got him killed. I'm sure of it." As they parted, Miss Marple tucked the receipt beside the blackmail letter in her reticule. The rain had eased, and the lighthouse beam began its evening sweep, cutting through the gathering dusk. She made her way back to the inn, her thoughts tangled like yarn. The key Morwenna held, the receipt, the blackmail letter. They were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still unclear. In the inn's common room, she overheard Jago Polwell talking with a fisherman, his voice low but heated. Samuel knew too much, he muttered. Always poking into things that weren't his business. He fell silent as Miss Marple entered, his dark eyes meeting hers for a moment, before he turned away. Mrs. Trelawney was polishing glasses behind the bar, her movements brisk. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. Mrs. Trelawney, a quick word. You mentioned lending money to Samuel years ago. Was it, by chance, a large sum? Perhaps 10 years back. The innkeeper's hand froze, the glass nearly slipping. 10 years? That was ages ago. Yes, I lent him money, but it was for the lighthouse. Like I said. Why do you ask? Oh, just tying up loose ends, Miss Marple said, airily. Memories can be so unreliable, can't they? Like trying to knit in the dark. Mrs. Trelawney's face flushed, and she busied herself with another glass. Miss Marple added to her notebook, Morwenna's key wave engraving, receipt, silence secured. Trelawney nervous. Jago's words. Samuel knew too much. The lighthouse beam swept past, its light relentless. Miss Marple felt it was mocking her, daring her to uncover what it hid. But she was patient. Secrets, like stitches, revealed themselves in time. Chapter 6. The Fisherman's Tale. The harbour of St. Agnes's Cove was alive with the morning's bustle, the air thick with the scent of salt and fish. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries mingling with the creak of boats and the low voices of fishermen hauling net. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her tweed coat against the chill October breeze, made her way along the quay. Her umbrella tapped a steady rhythm, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the gull's cry. Jago Polweller's boat, where the fisherman was coiling rope with practiced ease. His words from the previous evening, Samuel knew too much, echoed in her mind, a thread she intended to tug. The clues were mounting. The blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, Morwenna's mysterious key, the receipt for silence secured, and now Jago's cryptic remark. Miss Marple sensed the lighthouse was more than a backdrop. It was the heart of the mystery, its unerring beam concealing a truth about Samuel Tregonnis's death. Jago, with his guarded demeanor and proximity to the cliffs, might hold another piece of the puzzle. Good morning, Mr. Polweller, she called, pausing by his boat. Her voice was bright, but her gaze was as keen as a needle. A fine day for fishing, I imagine? Jago glanced up, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. Miss Marple, he said, his Cornish accent rough as the sea. Not much for fishing today. Nets need mending, and the tide's against me. What brings you to the harbour? Oh, just a stroll, she said airily, leaning on her umbrella. The sea has such stories, doesn't it? I was thinking of Mr. Tregonnis. You must have known him well, living so close to the lighthouse. Jago's hands stilled on the rope, his knuckles whitening. Knew him well enough. He was the keeper, I was a fisherman. We crossed paths, but we weren't mates. Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile disarming. Yet you saw the lighthouse beam the night he died, from out at sea. It must have been a comfort, knowing Samuel was there keeping it steady. Jago snorted, resuming his work. Comfort? That beam's a curse as much as a blessing. Samuel was proud of it though. Too proud maybe. Always said it'd never fail. Not on his watch. Proud, Miss Marple echoed, her eyes noting the tension in his shoulders. And yet he fell, despite knowing those cliffs so well. I heard you found him, Mr. Polwellers. That must have been a shock. Jago's jaw tightened, and he tossed the rope aside, standing to face. It was dawn, it was. When I was heading out, saw him on the rocks, all broken. Thought at first he'd slipped, but he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the cliffs, where the lighthouse stood. But, Miss Marple prompted, her voice gentle but insistent, Jago hesitated, then lowered his voice. Samuel wasn't one to slip. He'd walked that path in storms worse than that night. And there's something else. Years back, 20 years maybe, he wasn't always a keeper. Sailed with a rough crew out of Plymouth, smugglers. Some say he left that life when he took the lighthouse. But folk don't forget. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to itch for action. Smugglers, how fascinating. Did he ever speak of those days? Not to me, Jago said gruffly. But he had a way of looking at you, like he knew your secrets. Made enemies that way. Me, I just wanted to fish in peace. But he'd warn me off the rocks near the lighthouse. Said they were dangerous. I reckon he was hiding something there. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Hiding something? Near the rocks, you say? That's curious. Did you ever see anything unusual there? Jago's eyes flickered, as if weighing his words. Once years ago, I saw him rowing out at night, near low tide. Thought he was checking crab pots, but he was too quick, too secretive. Never saw it again, but it stuck with me. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. Thank you, Miss Pulwell. You've been most helpful. Oh, one last thing. Did you notice anything odd in Samuel's boat, perhaps, when you were near the lighthouse? Jago frowned, caught off guard. His boat? Kept it moored by the jetty, not far from mine. Never looked inside. Why? Oh, just a thought, she said, her smile serene. Boats are like people, aren't they? Full of surprises. As she turned to leave, she glanced at the gull's cry. Tucked under a tarp was a pair of boots, their soles caked with mud. The tread looked familiar, too familiar. The boot print on the cliff path, she thought, her mind racing. She made a mental note to revisit the harbour later. Her walk took her past the jetty, where Samuel's small rowboat bobbed against its moorings. On impulse, she stepped closer, peering inside. The boat was weathered, but tidy, with oars stowed neatly. In the stern, half hidden under a coil of rope, was a scrap of fabric blue, with a faint pattern of waves. Miss Marple's breath caught. It matched the shawl Morwenna had worn yesterday. What was Morwenna doing in her father's boat? Back at the inn, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Jago's tale of Samuel's smuggling past, the secretive rowing trips, the boot print, and now Morwenna's fabric. They were threads in a tapestry growing ever more complex. She opened her notebook and wrote, Jago's story, smuggling, Samuel's nighttime rowing. Boot print matches Jago's. Morwenna's shawl in boat. What did Samuel hide? Mrs. Trelawney bustled in with tea, her eyes lingering on Miss Marple's notebook. Still poking about, Miss Marple? She asked, her tone half joking, half wary. Oh, just keeping my thoughts in order, Miss Marple said, her smile innocent. Tell me, Mrs. Trelawney, did Samuel ever mention his days at sea? Before the lighthouse, I mean. The innkeeper's face tightened. Not much. Said he'd seen enough of the world to know he preferred the light. Why? No reason, Miss Marple said airily. Just curious about the man behind the beam. As the lighthouse began its evening sweep, its light cutting through the harbour's dusk, Miss Marple felt the mystery deepening. Samuel's past was a shadow cast across the present, and someone, Jago, Morwenna, or another, had ensured it stayed buried. But shadows, she knew, could not hide from light forever. Chapter 7, The Vicar's Confession. Agnes's Cove stood sombre under a sky heavy with clouds, its stone walls weathered by years of salt and storm. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tucked under her arm, stepped through the arched doorway into the cool, dim interior. The scent of wax and old hymnals greeted her, and the faint creak of pews echoed as Reverend Penrose emerged from the vestry. His face, usually composed, bore a shadow of unease, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands fidgeted with his prayer book. His cryptic mention of a shadow on the cliffs the night Samuel Tregennis died had lingered in her mind, a loose thread demanding attention. The clues were piling up like driftwood. The blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, Morwenna's wave-engraved key, the receipt for silence secured, Jago's tale of Samuel's smuggling past, and the scrap of Morena's shawl in her father's boat. Each pointed to a secret Samuel had guarded, one that had cost him his life. The lighthouse beam, unwavering as ever, seemed to mock her with its silence. Reverend Penrose, with his nervous glances and hesitant words, might hold another piece of the puzzle. "Good afternoon, Reverend," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of purpose. She settled into a pew, her knitting bag at her side. "I was hoping you might spare a moment for tea. Lady Tressilian kindly sent some biscuits from the manor." The vicar managed a weak smile, though his eyes darted to the stained glass window, where the lighthouse glowed in coloured shards. "Of course, Miss Marple. Tea would be most welcome." He led her to the vicarage, a modest cottage beside the church, where a kettle was soon whistling. As they sat with steaming cups, Miss Marple's needles began their familiar rhythm. "This is a charming village," she said, her tone conversational, "but I sense it's been troubled since Mr. Tregennis's death. You mentioned seeing a shadow on the cliffs that night." "It stayed with me, that detail." Reverend Penrose's cup clinked against its saucer. "Did I?" "Yes, well, it was nothing, really. Just a trick of the light, perhaps. I was walking praying as I often do when the village is quiet." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Prayer is a great comfort. But a shadow moving quickly near the lighthouse. It's curious, isn't it? Especially since Samuel was found dead soon after. Did you recognize anything about it? A shape, perhaps? Or a manner of movement?" The vicar's fingers tightened on his cup, and a flush crept up his neck. No, it was too dark, too far. I assumed it was Samuel checking the path. But I've been thinking, Miss Marple, and I feel I must unburden myself." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Samuel came to me a week before he died. He was troubled. He said he'd sinned long ago, and feared the truth would come out." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment. "Sinned? Did he say what he'd done?" Penrose shook his head, his eyes fixed on the table. "He wouldn't confess fully, only that it was tied to his days at sea before the lighthouse. He asked for guidance, but I could tell he was holding back. I urged him to make amends, but he said it was too late, that someone else knew." "Someone else," Miss Marple murmured, her mind flashing to the blackmail letter. "Did he name this person?" "No," Penrose said, his voice strained. "But he was afraid. He kept saying the lighthouse would keep his secret, that it always had. I didn't understand, but I felt his fear. That night, when I saw the shadow, I wonder now if it was someone meeting him." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts racing. "And where were you, Reverend, after you saw this shadow? You said you returned home." "Yes," he said quickly. "I was home by 10:30. My housekeeper, Mrs. Cobb, can confirm it. She was mending curtains in the parlour." Miss Marple nodded, though she noted the haste in his reply. An alibi, offered unprompted. "Thank you, Reverend. It's a comfort to know you were safe at home. Though I wonder, did Samuel ever mention a key, or perhaps a box he kept hidden?" Penrose's eyes widened, then quickly shuttered. "A key? No, nothing like that. He spoke of the lighthouse, always the lighthouse. It was his life, you know." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "It's remarkable, isn't it, how a lighthouse can be both a beacon and a keeper of secrets." As she left the vicarage, the drizzle had returned, misting her spectacles. She paused by the churchyard, where Morena's flowers still lay on Samuel's grave. The vicar's confession, if it could be called that, had revealed more than he intended. His fear, his quick alibi, his mention of Samuel's past sin pointed to a deeper involvement, and the lighthouse, always the lighthouse. Back at the Seagull Inn, Miss Marple found Mrs. Trelawney sweeping the common room. The innkeeper's eyes flicked to her, wary as ever. "Tea with the vicar, was it?" she asked, her tone sharp. "He's been jumpy since Samuel died. Keeps praying like the devil's at his heels." "Oh, he's just grieving," Miss Marple said lightly. though he did mention Samuel's troubled state. Did you ever hear Samuel speak of his past, Mrs. Trelawney? Perhaps something from his seafaring days. Mrs. Trelawney's broom stilled. Seafaring. He left that behind. When he took the light. Said it was a rough life. Not worth talking about. Why do you keep asking about old stories? Just piecing things together, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she settled by the fire. Like a quilt, you know. Every scrap matters. As the lighthouse beam began its evening sweep, Miss Marple opened her notebook. She wrote, Penrose, Samuel's sin, someone new, alibi, with housekeeper, lighthouse, as secret keeper, Trelawney evasive again. The beam's relentless arc seemed to challenge her, but Miss Marple was undaunted. Secrets, like stitches, could be unraveled with patience. Chapter 8. The Innkeeper's Ledger. The Seagull Inn was quiet in the late morning, its common room empty save for the crackle of the fire, and the faint clink of glasses, as Mrs. Trelawney polished them behind the bar. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles moving steadily, though her eyes were fixed on the lighthouse in the distance. Its white tower stood stark against the grey sky, the beam dormant but ever present in her thought. The clues were weaving together. Mariner's key, the blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, the receipt for silence secured, Jago's smuggling tales, and Reverend Penrose's nervous confession. Each pointed to a secret Samuel Trelawney had died to protect, and Mrs. Trelawney, with her evasive answers and flushed cheeks, was a thread Miss Marple could no longer ignore. The innkeeper's ledger, she decided, might hold answers. Money in her experience was as revealing as gossip, and Mrs. Trelawney's claim of a long-ago loan to Samuel begged scrutiny. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and approached the bar, her smile as disarming as ever. Mrs. Trelawney, she said, I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment. I'm trying to understand Mr. Trelawney's life here, and you've been so helpful already. Mrs. Trelawney's hands paused on a glass, her eyes wary. Helpful, am I? I've told you what I know, Miss Marple. Samuel ate here, paid his bills, kept to himself. What more is there? Oh, just the little things, Miss Marple said, her tone light. For instance, that loan you mentioned. Years ago. It must have been quite a sum for lighthouse repairs. Do you keep records of such things? I find ledgers so illuminating. The innkeeper's face tightened, and she set the glass down with a clink. Ledger? I don't keep papers from 10 years back. The inn barely makes ends meet as it is. Why do you care about an old debt? Miss Marple leaned on her umbrella, her gaze steady. Old debts have a way of lingering, don't they? Like a stain on a favorite shore. I thought perhaps your records might show if Samuel owed anyone else or if someone owed him. Mrs. Trelawney's flush deepened, and she turned to rearrange a shelf of bottles. If you must know, I've a ledger in the back, but it's private. I lent Samuel money. He paid most of it back, and that's the end of it. No need to dig up old business. Of course, Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering, though I wonder if I might glance at it, just to settle my curiosity. Lady Tressilian would vouch for my discretion. The mention of Lady Tressilian had its effect. Mrs. Trelawney hesitated, then muttered, Wait here. She disappeared into a back room, and returned with a worn ledger. Its pages yellowed. This is from 10 years ago. Don't know what you expect to find. Miss Marple opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures. Most entries were mundane, bar tabs, room rents, but one caught her eye. A loan of £200 to Samuel Trelawney, dated 1920. Scrawled beside it was another entry, partially smudged, received 50. Most interesting, Miss Marple murmured, her mind flashing to Reverend Penrose. P for Penrose. This loan was quite generous, Mrs. Trelawney. Was anyone else involved? A guarantor, perhaps? Mrs. Trelawney snatched the ledger back, her voice sharp. No one else. Just me and Samuel. He was good for it, mostly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've work to do. Miss Marple thanked her and returned to her seat, her needles resuming their rhythm. The ledger confirmed a financial tie to Samuel, but the initial P and the large sum suggested a deeper connection. Had Mrs. Trelawney been blackmailed too? Or was she hiding something more personal? Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Whodunit, who entered the inn looking windswept and anxious. She hesitated at the sight of Miss Marple, then approached. Miss Marple, I've been thinking about that key. I tried it at Father's cottage, but it didn't fit any lock. I'm starting to think it's for something at the lighthouse. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. That's very helpful, my dear. Perhaps we could visit the lighthouse together. Another pair of eyes might find what I missed. Morena nodded, though her hands trembled. Tomorrow. Maybe. It's hard to go there, knowing he's gone. As Morena left, Miss Marple overheard a snippet of conversation from two fishermen at the bar. Jago's been odd since Samuel died, one muttered. Keeps checking his boat at all hours like he's hiding something. Miss Marple's needles paused. Jago's boat again, she thought, recalling the muddy boots and Morena's shore. That afternoon she took a walk to the harbour, hoping to glimpse Jago's boat, but the gull's cry was gone, out to sea. Instead, she found Reverend Penrose by the jetty, staring at the waves. His face was drawn, and he started as she approached. Miss Marple, he said, his voice unsteady. I didn't see you there. I was just taking the air. Of course, she said, her smile kind but probing. The sea is so calming, isn't it? Though I've been thinking about Samuel. Did he ever mention money troubles to you? Perhaps a loan he struggled to repay? Penrose's eyes widened, then darted away. Money? No, he never spoke of that. He was a private man, as I said. Why do you ask? Oh, just village talk, Miss Marple said airily. I heard he borrowed from Mrs. Trelawney once. I thought he might have confided in you as his vicar. Penrose shook his head too quickly. No, nothing like that. I must go, parish duties. He hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to watch the lighthouse beam begin its evening sweep. Back at the inn, she opened her notebook and wrote, Ledger, £200, 1. Initial P. Penrose, Trelawney hiding more than a debt. Morena's key for lighthouse. Jago's boat suspicious. The beam's arc seemed to taunt her, but Miss Marple felt the pattern emerging. Money? Secrets? And the lighthouse were intertwined. And someone, perhaps Miss Trelawney, perhaps Penrose, knew more than they admitted. Chapter 9. The storm's revelation. The sky over St. Agnes's Cove had darkened to a bruise by late afternoon, the air heavy with the promise of a storm. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of the Seagull Inn, her knitting needles idle as she watched the first drops of rain lash the glass. The lighthouse beam, already lit against the gathering gloom, swept across the village with its relentless rhythm. The clues were piling up. Morena's key with its wave engraving, the blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, the receipt for silence secured, Jago's smuggling tales, Reverend Penrose's nervous confession, and the ledger's mysterious initial P. Each thread pointed to a secret Samuel Tregennis had died to protect, and Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. Tonight, she sensed, the storm might shake loose a truth. Trelawney had closed the inn early, citing the weather, but a small group had gathered in the common room, seeking shelter. Jago Pulwirley, his oilskin coat dripping, sat by the fire nursing a pint. Morena Tregennis hovered near the door, her shawl clutched tightly, as if ready to flee. Reverend Penrose, his face pale, sat at a corner table, his prayer book untouched. Lady Tressilian, ever the gracious host, had joined them, insisting Miss Marple stay for warmth and company. The atmosphere was taut, the storm outside mirrored by the unspoken tensions within. Quite a night, Miss Marple said, her voice breaking the silence. It reminds me of stories from my village, where storms bring out truths people prefer to keep hidden. Jago snorted, his eyes on the fire. Storms don't care about truths, they just wreck what's in their way. Marina glanced at him, her voice sharp. Like the cliffs wrecked my father? Or was that someone's doing, Jago? The room stilled, the only sound the howl of the wind. Jago's hand tightened on his glass. Watch your tongue, Marina. I found him, didn't I? Didn't push it, didn't you? Marina snapped, her eyes blazing. You hated him, always arguing about those rocks. And you were out that night on your boat. Jago stood, his face darkening. I was fishing, girl. And you weren't so fond of Samuel yourself, running off to London, leaving him alone. Enough? Reverend Penrose's voice cut through, trembling but firm. This is a house of peace, not accusations. We're all grieving Samuel in our way. Mrs. Trelawney slammed a tray of cups on the bar, her voice sharp. Grieving? Some of us are just trying to keep our heads above water. Samuel's death has brought nothing but trouble, gossip, questions, and now you lot bickering like gulls. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, her eyes darting between them. Grief does stir up old wounds, she said mildly. But I wonder if Samuel's death wasn't about an old wound, a secret perhaps, from his seafaring days. Did he ever speak of it to any of you? The question hung in the air, heavy as the storm. Penrose's hands shook, and he looked away. Mrs. Trelawney busied herself with the tray, her lips tight. Jago stared into his pint, silent. But Marina's voice, low and bitter, broke the tension. He told me once years ago he'd done something he couldn't undo, something that cost someone dearly. He said the lighthouse was his penance. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Penance? Did he say what it was, my dear? Marina shook her head, her eyes glistening. No, but he gave me that key, said it was for safety. I think it's for something hidden in the lighthouse. Something someone wanted. Jago's head snapped up. Hidden? What's this about a key? Marina's face paled, as if she'd said too much. It's nothing. Just something he gave me. Nothing? Jago pressed, his voice hard. Samuel was always sneaking about, rowing out at odd hours. If he hid something, it's no surprise someone came looking. Mrs. Trelawney's tray clattered, a cup rolling to the floor. Rowing? What nonsense. Samuel kept that light, nothing more. All this talk of secrets, it's rubbish. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the innkeeper's flush. Yet secrets have a way of surfacing, she said. Like that loan you gave Samuel, Mrs. Trelawney. The ledger showed a large sum, and an initial P. Could that be you, Reverend Penrose? The vicar's face drained of colour, his prayer book slipping to the table. I never lent Samuel money. I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Trelawney's voice was sharp. That was my husband's initial, Peter Trelawney. He handled the books before he died. Nothing to do with the vicar. Miss Marple nodded, though her mind raced. Peter Trelawney, dead these 8 years. The initial could be a coincidence, but Penrose's panic suggested otherwise. Of course, she said, her tone soothing. My mistake. Though it's curious, isn't it, how money and secrets intertwine? The storm roared outside, a gust rattling the windows. Lady Tressilian, silent until now, spoke up. Jane, you're stirring a hornet's nest. But I'll admit, Samuel's death never sat right with me. That beam never faltered. How could he fall, knowing those cliffs so well? Exactly, Marina said, her voice breaking. Someone was there. Someone made him go out on that path. Jago slammed his glass down. You're all mad, seeing ghosts where there's none. Samuel fell, that's all. And I'm sick of being eyed like a criminal. He stormed out, the door banging behind him. Penrose rose, muttering about checking the church, and Marina slipped out soon after, leaving Miss Marple, with Mrs. Trelawney, and Lady Tressilian. The innkeeper's hands trembled as she swept up the broken cup. Your trouble, Miss Marple, she muttered, digging where you shouldn't. Oh, I only seek the truth, Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. And truth, like a lighthouse beam, has a way of finding its mark. Back in her room she opened her notebook and wrote, Storm tensions flare. Moravena's key tied to lighthouse secret. Jago defensive. Penrose panicked. Trelawney's husband's initial, or Penrose's. The beam swept past her window, its light unyielding. Miss Marple felt the mystery's threads pulling tighter, but one knot remained. What had Samuel hidden, and who had killed to claim it? Chapter 10. The Lighthouse's Secret. The storm had passed by morning, leaving St. Agnes's Cove bathed in a pale watery light. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a hearty breakfast at the Seagull Inn, set out for the lighthouse, her umbrella tapping the damp path. The cliffs glistened, and the sea churned below, a restless reminder of last night's tension. The storm had shaken loose accusations, Moravena's claim of a hidden secret, Jago's defensiveness, Reverend Penrose's panic, and Mrs. Trelawney's evasiveness over the ledger's initial P. But the lighthouse, with its unwavering beam, remained the heart of the mystery. Miss Marple was certain it held a secret, tied to Samuel Tregnes's death, and Moravena's wave-engraved key was her guide. The clues were a tangled skein, the blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, the receipt for silence secured, Jago's smuggling tales, Penrose's confession of Samuel's past sin, the ledger's £200 loan, and the scrap of Moravena's shawl in Samuel's boat. Each pointed to a secret Samuel had guarded, one that had lured him to the cliffs that fatal night. Miss Marple's visit to the lighthouse was no whim. She suspected Moravena's key unlocked more than a box. The lighthouse itself, with its perfect beam, concealed a mechanism or hiding place she had overlooked. Moravena had agreed to join her, though reluctantly, and they met at the cliff path's base. The young woman's face was drawn, her shawl blue with its wave pattern clutched tight. "I'm not sure about this," Moravena said, her voice trembling. "The lighthouse, it feels like his ghost is still there." Miss Marple's smile was kind but firm. "Ghosts are only memories, my dear. Let's see what your key reveals. It may bring peace to your father's memory." They climbed the path, the wind tugging at their clothes. The lighthouse loomed above, its white tower stark against the sky. The door was unlocked as before, and Miss Marple noted the brass key still in the lock. 2 keys in Samuel's possession, and now Moravena's, she thought. Inside the air was cool, smelling of oil and metal. The spiral staircase wound upward, but Miss Marple paused at the base, her eyes scanning the walls. "Try your key, Moravena," she said, gesturing to the hatch she'd found on her last visit, half hidden behind a coil of rope. "It didn't fit the cottage, you said. Perhaps it belongs here." Moravena hesitated, then knelt, her fingers trembling as she inserted the key. It turned with a soft click, and the hatch swung open. Inside was the same storage space Miss Marple had seen, wicks, oil, the tin box of papers. But Moravena gasped, pointing to a small panel in the back, barely visible. "There's another lock," she whispered. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The panel's lock was tiny, matching Moravena's key. With a nod, Moravena turned it, and the panel slid aside, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed, and a small sealed envelope. Miss Marple took them carefully, her hand steady despite the thrill of discovery. "Let's look at these upstairs," she said, leading Moravena to the lantern room. The great lens gleamed, its gears silent in the daylight. Miss Marple opened the journal first, scanning Samuel's tight script. It was a log, not of lighthouse duties, but of his past, a confession of sorts. One entry, dated 1918, read, "The wreck of the Mary Rose was no accident. I took the gold, hid it in the rocks. Penrose knows paid him to keep silent. God forgive me." Miss Marple's breath caught. Gold, smuggling, Penrose. She glanced at Moravena, whose eyes were wide with shock. "Your father was involved in a wreck," she said gently. "It seems he hid something valuable, and paid to keep it secret." Moravena shook her head, tears welling. "Gold, he never spoke of wealth. Why keep this?" Miss Marple opened the envelope, revealing a map sketched in Samuel's hand. It marked a cave in the rocks below the lighthouse, accessible only at low tide. "He hid it here," she murmured, "and someone found out. As she spoke, a creak echoed from below. Morwenna froze, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Stay here," she whispered, tucking the journal and map into her reticule. She descended the stairs, her umbrella gripped like a weapon. At the base she found Jago Polwiller, his oilskin coat damp, his face set in a scowl. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "didn't expect to find you here. What's that girl doing poking about, helping me understand her father?" Miss Marple said, her tone calm but steely. "And you, Mr. Polwiller, why visit the lighthouse?" Jago's eyes flicked to the hatch, still open. "Heard you were up here. Thought you might need assistance. Those stairs are steep." "How kind," Miss Marple said, her smile sharp. "But we're quite safe. Though I wonder, did you ever search the rocks below where Samuel warned you off? Perhaps looking for something valuable?" Jago's face darkened. But before he could reply, Morwenna appeared at the stairs, clutching the key. "Miss Marple, we should go," she said, her voice trembling. They left Jago behind, his gaze burning into their backs. Outside the tide was low, exposing the rocks below. Miss Marple glanced at the map in her reticule, her mind racing. The cave was real and Samuel's gold or its promise had drawn a killer. But the lighthouse itself held another secret. On her last visit she'd noticed the lantern's gears seemed too complex for a simple beam. She resolved to return with a mechanic's eye, or Lady Tressilian's nephew, who knew machines. Back at the inn, Miss Marple wrote in her notebook, "Journal gold from Mary Rose wreck." Penrose paid for silence. Map to cave, Jago at lighthouse. Suspicious. Lantern gears odd. The beam swept past, its rhythm unchanged, but Miss Marple knew it hid a trick. A mechanism, perhaps, that let Samuel leave the light unattended. The killer had used it and she was close to proving how. Chapter 11. The Gathering at the Cove. The evening air in St. Agnes Cove was sharp with salt and the lingering damp of the storm's aftermath. Miss Jane Marple stood in the common room of the Seagull Inn, her knitting bag at her side, as the lighthouse beam swept across the windows. Lady Tressilian had arranged a gathering at Miss Marple's request, insisting the key figures in Samuel Tregennis's death. Morwenna Tregennis, Jago Polwiller, Reverend Penrose, and Mrs. Trelawney joined them for what she called a clarifying discussion. The room was tense. The fires crackled the only sound as they took their seats, their faces a mix of weariness and defiance. Miss Marple knew the time had come to lay out her deductions, to unravel the threads of blackmail, secrets, and gold that had led to murder. But she also knew the killer was among them, and a final twist awaited. The clues had woven a tight pattern: the blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, Morwenna's wave-engraved key, the receipt for silence secured, Jago's smuggling tales, Penrose's confession of Samuel's sin, the ledger's £200 loan with the initial P, and the journal revealing Samuel's theft of gold from the Mary Rose wreck, hidden in a cave below the lighthouse. The lantern's complex gears suggested a mechanism that allowed the beam to run unattended, explaining how Samuel could have left the lighthouse that fatal night. Miss Marple was ready to expose the killer, but not without a careful trap. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Samuel Tregennis's death was no accident, and I believe we can uncover the truth, caper. Let's start with the night he died. October. The lighthouse beam never faltered, yet Samuel was found dead on the rocks below. How could a man so familiar with the cliff's fall? Jago Polwiller shifted in his chair, his oilskin coat creaking. "He slipped, didn't he? Path was wet, and he was getting old." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Old perhaps, but steady. Dr. Pengelly confirmed Samuel was fit, with no history of clumsiness, and the beam's steadiness is key. I found a journal in the lighthouse, hidden behind a locked panel. It revealed Samuel's past, a smuggling venture, a wreck called the Mary Rose, and he stole gold and hid it in a cave below the lighthouse. Someone knew and blackmailed him." Morwenna gasped, her hand clutching her shawl. "Father, a smuggler. That's why he gave me the key." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. The key opened a compartment with his confession and a map to the cave, but someone else knew his secret. A letter I found demanded he meet them or face exposure. It bore the Trelawney crest. Mrs. Trelawney's face reddened, her hands gripping the bar. My crest? That's nonsense. Anyone could have used my paper. I lent Samuel money. Yes, but I didn't blackmail him. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. But your ledger showed a £200 loan to Samuel in 1928, marked with the initial P. You said it was your late husband, Peter. Yet the sum was far too large for lighthouse repairs. And Reverend Penrose, you admitted Samuel confessed a sin to you, one tied to his seafaring days. You said someone else knew. Penrose's face paled, his prayer book trembling in his hands. I only counseled him. I never spoke of it to anyone. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly in her bag. Yet someone did. Jago. You spoke of Samuel's smuggling past, and his secretive rowing trips. You found his body, and I saw boots on your boat with treads matching a print on the cliff path. Were you searching for his gold? Jago's eyes blazed. I'm no thief. I fished those rocks, yes. But I didn't kill him. I was on my boat that night, like I said. Indeed, Miss Marple said, but the lighthouse beam intrigues me. Its gears are too complex for a simple light. I believe Samuel rigged a mechanism to keep it running unattended, allowing him to leave for his meeting. Someone knew this. Someone who lured him to the cliffs and pushed him. The room was silent, all eyes on her. Morwenna's voice broke the tension. Who, Miss Marple? Who would do that? Miss Marple's gaze swept the group, settling on Mrs. Trelawney. Mrs. Trelawney, your loan to Samuel wasn't for repairs, was it? It was to buy your silence. You knew about the Mary Rose gold, perhaps from your husband, who sailed with Samuel. When the debt went unpaid, you saw a chance to claim the gold. You wrote the blackmail letter, using your own paper, and met Samuel on the cliffs. When he refused to reveal the cave, you pushed him. Mrs. Trelawney's face crumpled, her voice a hiss. That's a lie. I never went near the cliffs. I was here at the inn, all night. Were you? Miss Marple said, her voice sharp. Old Tom saw a lantern on the cliffs at 10, and your ledger's initial P. It wasn't Peter, but a clumsy attempt to shift blame. You knew Samuel's secret, and you killed to claim it. Miss Trelawney staggered back, her hands shaking. No, I only wanted what was mine. Her words faltered, and she sank into a chair, tears streaming. He owed me years of debt, and he laughed when I asked for the gold. I followed him. Yes, but I didn't mean to push him. He slipped. I swear. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. A slip, perhaps, but caused by your confrontation. You left him to die, and the beam covered your crime. The room erupted, Morwenna sobbing, Jago cursing, Penrose praying. Lady Tressilian called for the constable, who arrived to take Mrs. Trelawney away. But as they left, Miss Marple paused, her mind catching on a detail. The shawl in Samuel's boat. Morwenna was there too, she thought, her heart sinking. The truth wasn't complete. Back at the inn, she wrote in her notebook. Trelawney confessed. Blackmail. Confrontation. Accidental push. But Morwenna's shawl. Why in the boat? The beam swept past, its light unyielding. A final twist loomed, and Miss Marple knew the lighthouse held one last secret. Chapter 12. The Final Beam. The morning mist clung to St. Agnes's Cove, softening the cliffs and muting the sea's restless churn. Miss Jane Marple sat in the Seagull Inn's parlour, her knitting needle still, her reticule open with Samuel Tregennis's journal, the blackmail letter, and the map to the cave. Miss Trelawney's confession last night had unravelled much of the mystery. She had blackmailed Samuel over his stolen gold from the Mary Rose wreck, and confronted him on the cliffs, leading to his fatal fall. Yet one thread remained loose, the scrap of Morwenna's shawl in Samuel's boat. It suggested she had been near the lighthouse that night, and Miss Marple knew the truth was not complete until every stitch was accounted for. The clues were now clear. The blackmail letter with the Trelawney crest, Morwenna's wave-engraved key, the receipt for silence secured. Jago's smuggling tales, Reverend Penrose's knowledge of Samuel's sin, the ledger's £200 loan, and the journal's confession of gold hidden in a cave. The lighthouse's complex gears had allowed Samuel to leave the beam unattended, explaining his presence on the cliffs, but Morwenna's shawl nagged at Miss Marple, a sign she had been involved, perhaps not in murder, but in something that night. Miss Marple arranged to meet Morwenna at the lighthouse, sensing the young woman held the final piece. They climbed the cliff path together, the lighthouse looming above, its beam dormant in the daylight. Morwenna's face was pale, her shawl, the same blue with wave patterns, clutched tightly. "Why here, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Trelawney confessed. "Isn't it over?" "Not quite, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "There's something you haven't told me. I found a piece of your shawl in your father's boat. Were you there the night he died?" Morwenna's voice broke, her hands twisting the shawl. "I didn't tell you everything, Miss Marple. That night before he went to the inn, I went to his cottage. I begged him to give up the gold, to tell whoever was threatening him. He was angry, said I didn't understand, that the gold was his burden, not mine. I left in a huff, but I couldn't let it go. I took his boat to the cave, thinking if I found it, I could end his torment. That's how my shawl got caught. But when I heard voices on the cliffs, his and another, I was too scared to stay. If I'd stayed, maybe he'd still be alive." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was sharp. "You were trying to save him, my dear, but your silence protected his secret, and helped uncover the truth." Miss Marple nodded, the final pieces falling into place. "You were protecting your father's wish, weren't you? That's why you didn't tell anyone." "I thought if I spoke they'd take the gold," Morwenna whispered. "He wanted it to make amends. I failed him." "No, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You've helped uncover the truth. Mrs. Trelawney's greed led to his death, but your courage will see his wish fulfilled." They returned to the village, where Miss Marple met Lady Tressilian at the manor. She shared the journal and map, urging her to contact authorities to recover the gold and distribute it to the Mary Rose families. Lady Tressilian agreed, her eyes grave. "You've done a remarkable thing, Jane. But what of the others?" Penrose Jag. "Reverend Penrose took money to keep silent," Miss Marple said. "He's guilty of cowardice, not murder. Jago suspected the gold but didn't kill for it. Their consciences will judge them." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the lighthouse one last time. Alone, she climbed to the lantern room, where the gears gleamed. With Lady Tressilian's nephew's help, she'd confirmed her suspicion. A hidden timer allowed the beam to run for hours unattended, a secret Samuel had used to meet his blackmailer. The killer had known it too, ensuring the beam covered their crime. Back at the inn, she packed her bags, her work done. The constable had taken Mrs. Trelawney to Plymouth for trial, and Morwenna was preparing to leave. The gold's burden lifted. Miss Marple opened her notebook and wrote, "Case closed. Trelawney blackmailed Samuel, pushed him in a struggle." Morwenna's shawl explained, she sought to honor his redemption. Lighthouse beam hid the truth, but light always finds a way. As the train pulled away from Agnes's Cove, the lighthouse beam swept across the sea, steady as ever. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. Villages, like lighthouses, held shadows, but a patient eye could always find the truth.